There is a quiet assumption most of us carry, without realizing it. An assumption so deeply woven into daily life that questioning it feels unnecessary. When you open a banking app and see a balance, the mind treats that number as a solid fact, almost physical, like something that could be touched if needed. Yet history suggests that money has rarely been solid. It has always depended less on metal, paper, or screens, and more on a shared belief that tomorrow will resemble today. For most of human history, wealth was obvious and heavy. Grain in storage, land under control, animals that could be counted. Even when gold and silver became money, their power came from scarcity and effort. Digging, refining, guarding, value was slow. Then something subtle changed. People realized that security mattered more than possession. A locked vault was safer than a travel chest. Trust began to replace weight, and paper began to replace metal, not because it was stronger, but because it was easier to believe in. The moment trust entered the system, incentives followed. Those who held other people's wealth noticed patterns long before economists gave them names. Withdrawals were irregular. Fear came in waves, not constantly. Most days, nothing happened. From the perspective of someone watching the vault, the gold just sat there. Idle resources invite use, and so the idea emerged that unused wealth could be activated, not stolen, but temporarily promised elsewhere. The risk felt small, the reward felt rational. Over time, this behavior stopped feeling clever and started feeling normal. What mattered was not the deception, but the coordination. As long as everyone didn't act at once, the illusion held. The system didn't require perfection, only staggered behavior. This is an important detail that often gets missed. Financial systems rarely fail because they are mathematically impossible. They fail because human behavior shifts suddenly. Panic compresses time. What was once spread across months happens in hours. As states grew larger and wars more expensive, this logic scaled upward. Governments didn't just tolerate this system, they depended on it. Borrowing against future production allowed rulers to act now and explain later. Taxes, after all, are easier to collect when framed as obligations to stability rather than payments for past decisions. Debt became political glue, binding citizens to outcomes they did not vote on, and generations to costs they did not choose. By the time banking became institutional rather than personal, the abstraction was complete. Money no longer needed a story about gold. It needed a story about confidence. Central banks emerged not to eliminate risk, but to manage belief. They existed to answer a single dangerous question. What happens when everyone asks at once? The answer was not to prevent excess, but to promise rescue. Stability became less about balance and more about reassurance. Modern banking no longer even pretends that deposits wait patiently in a vault. The act of lending itself creates new money, not symbolically, but operationally. A loan is typed into existence, and the economy adjusts around it. This is efficient. It allows growth without delay. It also quietly ties the survival of the system to the continuation of borrowing. When money is born as debt, repayment becomes a threat rather than a virtue. This creates a strange inversion of morality. Saving is praised culturally, but discouraged structurally. Paying off debt feels responsible individually, yet dangerous collectively. If too many people become cautious at the same time, the flow slows, defaults rise, and confidence fractures. The system prefers motion over rest, participation over restraint. Stability is maintained, not by reducing risk, but by distributing it so widely that no single person can see the whole picture. Power concentrates, naturally, in such an environment. Those who can create money influence what gets built, which industries survive, which ideas scale. Access to credit becomes access to the future. This is rarely framed as control, but functionally, it is. Decisions made in conference rooms ripple outward into labor markets, housing prices, and political priorities. Most people feel the effects without ever seeing the source. Crises, when they arrive, are often described as failures of regulation or moments of greed. But they are better understood as moments when belief falters. The Great Depression, the financial crisis of 2008, regional banking panics before and after. Each followed the same emotional arc. Confidence quietly erodes, then collapses suddenly. The math didn't change overnight, the story did. Today, money is almost entirely digital, and its creation is governed less by physical limits than by regulatory frameworks and risk models. International agreements decide what counts as safe, what counts as liquid, what counts as acceptable exposure. These rules are complex by design, not to confuse the public, but to standardize behavior across institutions that would otherwise compete themselves into instability. Order is maintained not through restraint, but through coordination. There is an uncomfortable implication here. If everyone decided to step back at the same time, to reduce debt, to rely only on what already exists, much of the economic structure would simply fade. Not collapse dramatically, but contract quietly. Jobs would disappear, not because skills vanished, but because the flow that sustained them slowed. Money, in this sense, behaves less like a store of value and more like a current. It must move, or it weakens. This doesn't mean the system is evil or doomed. It means it is human. Built on incentives, habits, and shared assumptions, it rewards participation and punishes isolation. It amplifies confidence and magnifies fear. Understanding this does not require rejecting banks or withdrawing from society. It requires recognizing that numbers on a screen are not the same as independence, and that stability often rests on stories we agree not to question too closely. Throughout history, real resilience has come from things that exist outside balance sheets, skills that remain useful when markets shift, communities that function when institutions hesitate, assets that produce rather than promise. These forms of wealth rarely grow fastest in good times, but they endure longest in uncertain ones. The quiet truth is that money has always been less about possession and more about permission. Permission to act, to plan, to delay consequences. When that permission is widely trusted, systems expand. When it is questioned, they reveal their fragility. Seeing this clearly doesn't make you immune to the system, but it does change how you relate to it. And perhaps that is the real power of understanding money, not as something you have, but as something you participate in. If you'd like to explore more stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe for deeper reflections on history, power, and financial systems.